Japan Station is made possible in part by Patreon support. If you would like to make sure that I can keep bringing you more content like this, then head on over to japankyo.com/Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Welcome to Japan Station, a production of japankyo.com. I'm your host, Tony Vega. So first of all, happy 2023. Hope you have all been having a wonderful holiday season, and I hope this year turns out great for all of you. Just a quick update on the show. Last month, I didn't release a second episode. Normally, I release 2 episodes a month, but actually, technically, this is a monthly podcast. So the main episode comes out on the first of the month, like this one, and then the one that comes out on the 15th is what I call the bonus episode. Now, up until now, I've been able to release 2 episodes a month, pretty much every single month, except maybe like 2 or 3. But the reality is right now I am in a bit of a transition period with my employment. Things are kind of crazy and uncertain, and I'm kind of busy with other things, and I need to prioritize those things at the moment. I totally intend to keep doing the show, for the foreseeable future. But I can't, unfortunately, spend as much time as I did on it. Now, maybe I can discuss all this, much more in depth at a later point, but just know that I will be putting out an episode on the first of the month, as long as I can. And when I can, I'd love to put out a second episode, but unfortunately that will be much rarer moving forward, I think. But of course, any updates to the schedule, I will let you guys know. But make sure to hit that subscribe button in your podcast app so you don't miss out, because I know it can be easy to forget a tiny little show like this one if it's only coming out once a month. But if you really need another dose and you've only been listening to this show, go check out Ni-chōme Japan. That's my other show. And that one comes out on the 21st of the month. So you do get 2 episodes a month. You get Japan Station and then you get Ni-chōme Japan. So that's usually around 2 hours of content, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more. So that's what I can do at the moment. But, I really want to make sure that I can keep the quality up and keep finding guests that genuinely interest me and talk about topics that I actually find interesting and want to learn more about. So it takes a little bit of time to prepare everything. And right now I am a little bit short on time. So that's that. But anyway, let's get into the episode. I'm sorry for that long intro thing. I try to keep things really short at the top of the show, but let's get into it. So my guest today is Dr. Thomas Baudinette. He's a senior lecturer in Japanese and international studies at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Baudinette is also the author of the book Regimes of Desire, Young Gay Men, Media and Masculinity in Tokyo. So this is what we're going to be focusing on today, his research in Shinjuku's quote-unquote gay district, Ni-chōme, Japanese gay media, and depictions of gay and queer individuals in Japanese media. We're also going to talk a little bit about the kind of idol talent agency, Johnny's, and a couple other things here and there. So this was a really, really interesting conversation. If you're curious and you want to learn more about, this aspect of Japanese society, but also Dr. Baudinette's research, I highly recommend the book. It's a really, really interesting read. So you can find a link in the show notes, or of course you can just find it wherever you buy your books. Just look up Regimes of Desire. That's Regimes of Desire. Really easy to find. But anyway, let's get into it. Here is my conversation with Dr. Thomas Baudinette.
The next stop is Japan Station. The doors on the right side will open.
Let's see. All right, so let's just start with the super basic question. So how did you get into all this Japan stuff? What was like your kind of gateway into it? How did you get interested?
I think like many people, both within Australia and also maybe North America, from a young age, I grew up engaging with Japanese things without knowing that I was engaging with Japanese things. I have a very kind of strong memory that I often bring up, that I remember watching an episode of Sailor Moon when I was like young. It was on the TV here in Australia where I grew up, and just having this moment of like, wait, why are they in Tokyo? Kind of sparking in my mind.
Yeah.
And then I just kind of became hyper aware of that. And I've always been a kid who was interested in the outside world. And like I can remember my parents sitting down and we would read the encyclopedia and the atlas, and they gave us like books of maps and things. And I was always interested in places outside of my home, Australia, where and Japan was just one of many places that I was interested in. And then as I grew up, and that kind of passive popular culture of Japan boom in the 90s that was very formative to me, Pokemon, various anime, manga. I mean, I think this story is almost a cliche now, that I became increasingly interested in Japanese things until I was about 14, 15, and I was beginning to kind of come to terms with who I was as a person, and in particular my sexuality, which will be something I think that we're going to be talking about a lot today, sexuality and things like that.
Yeah.
And I stumbled across in a local bookstore just in Melbourne, the city where I live. Sorry, not a bookstore, I meant a library. And I just discovered a manga that happened to be focusing on two handsome boys falling in love with each other. And of course, this is the genre that many people know of now, and I, of course, know of now as boys love.
Yeah.
And that was a very transformative moment for me. And that just kind of led me to become interested in Japanese things in a more active way. So my engagement shifted from passive to active. Then I entered university after many years of consuming this stuff, decided that I would study Japanese language, had the opportunity to study abroad in Japan, became increasingly interested in a more kind of formal or academic sense in this kind of media that I had grown up consuming, which is these kind of queer popular culture texts from Japan. And the rest is history. Fell into the graduate student kind of pathway. And now here I am several years later working as an academic at an institution in Australia, exploring Japanese popular culture and its gendered politics and its circulation across East and Southeast Asia.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of us went through a similar process in that we started absorbing it before we even really knew, like, what is Japan? Like,
exactly. And it is a passive kind of enjoyment first. And I think that then opens up for some people, not everyone, but that opens up for many of us, this kind of, it lays a spark that then gets flamed or brought up in different ways. For me, it was that encounter with boys love. And then, to be honest, video games and the Final Fantasy series and my fan fictions based on members of characters from Final Fantasy. Like, this is my story. But for others, that might be a martial art. It might be anime, manga. It could be J-pop. I mean, idols are another thing that I'm super into, as anyone who follows my social media will know very, very well. These are just like, I think, things that often get looked down upon, actually. And I think that they shouldn't be, because they're very powerful gateways, especially when you've lived, like myself, in a very kind of Anglo, kind of white, suburban neighborhood with very little access to difference, and like it can spark an attraction to the world, and I'm always like about celebrating that.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, whatever gets you in, and then, you take that more active interest and you start to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And then, you become the educator eventually.
and then you spend your academic life like me, kind of undoing all of the myths and fantasies that you yourself used to participate in as a young person who had little direct access, which, I often say to my students, unfortunately, part of my job here is to kind of ruin Japan for you. But what I want to actually do is, it's like that famous comic of the guy who lives in Japan. It's like, oh, wow, you live in Japan. Hello Kitty. Woo. Hatsune Miku, Pokemon. And it's not that. But what it actually is vibrant and interesting in and of itself. And that's what I try and do with my students and my scholarship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about your research and I guess especially the book, Regimes of Desire? So could you tell us a little bit about what your work is and what you look into?
Okay. Yep. So let me reel off the formal academic spiel that we all do. I'm Dr. Thomas Baudinette, and I am a senior lecturer in international studies and Japanese studies at Macquarie University in Sydney, Japan. I'm trained in the discipline of cultural anthropology, and my research has primarily focused on the role that media and in particular popular culture play within forming knowledge about gender and sexuality in society, with a particular interest in queer media, so media that is aligned with non-heterosexual sexuality or gender performances that are diverse and kind of challenge kind of standard norms. And I particularly focus on same-sex desiring men as part of that. As a Japan specialist, though not a word that I like to really use, my specific interest is in the gendered politics of the media that exists within Japan, so Japanese media and both mainstream media as well as media produced for and by the gay male sexual minority community in Japan. And then prior, that work really led me to produce my first book, which is based on my PhD research, Regimes of Desire from University of Michigan Press, which explores how young gay men active within a nightlife district in Tokyo named Shinjuku Ni-chōme, which is a gay town, navigate the kind of structures that inform knowledge about what it means to desire other men as a man within kind of contemporary Japan. And then building upon that, I've recently shifted my research focus to explore more specifically the role that Japanese popular culture has played outside of Japan, particularly in East and Southeast Asia, in shaping knowledge around kind of broader queer experience, so across the whole LGBTQ community. And that's led me to really focus on the transnational spread of a genre of media called boys love, which I talked about briefly, and also its role in kind of shaping idol culture across Korea, Japan, and Thailand. And that's leading me back to Japan in many ways, because some of my more recent research and research directions are pushing me to think about the gendered politics of one particular company in Japan, Johnny's and Associates, which for anyone who is familiar with Japanese media culture would be aware is kind of the premier talent agency for male celebrities. And they have a particular look and a particular identity that is very formative to contemporary notions of gender, particularly in women's media cultures. So this is my research in a nutshell. So I have my fingers in a lot of pies, but it all really comes back to my interest in media and its role in shaping knowledge around gender and sex.
Yeah, so I definitely want to discuss some more like Johnny's and some other aspects of what you brought up, but I thought we'd start out a little bit with just I mean, this is something I personally noticed, and then like this is when I was living in Japan, like 2010 and to 2013, and I was watching TV. Or at least I had the TV on. Maybe I wasn't watching actively every single day, but because it can get kind of repetitive. But and I would notice like these. Of course, they call them talento, right? These TV personalities, like Matsuko Deluxe, and there's a bunch of other ones that were. I guess they would fall under the queer umbrella, although it was kind of unclear exactly who these people really were and what. My point is they came off as very cartoonish depictions of gay men, queer individuals, and I would never, as far as I remember, see somebody that was just like, oh, that's just a regular person. like they were, for the most part, like they were just very over the top characters and were very much in the vein of every other talento, which maybe there's some grain of truth in that exaggerated character that they portray, but they are in the end very exaggerated characters for entertainment purposes. So what can you kind of give us a little bit of insight on related to that? Like, what is the perception of that? Has that been changing? Is there like some more grounded depictions of gay queer individuals in Japanese media? Like what could you share?
Okay, so this type of talent that you're talking about here, Tony, and I'm sure many people who have casually watched Japanese, for example, wide or shore, these kind of infotainment shows that you see, particularly in the morning or in the evening, or the variety shows, the ubiquitous variety shows of Japanese television, have come across these hyper camp, often cross-dressing. I hesitate to call them men. Let's call them individuals, who are known in Japanese language as one talento or one ke talento, if I want to be more formal. So older sister talents. And this refers to a slang term that actually emerges from the site that I did my research in, Shinjuku Ni-chōme. One is a kind of affectionate term for a kind of performance, a kind of performance that we can trace back to Japan in the 1960s. This kind of cross-dressing gay male comedian with a sharp tongue and a hyper fashion sense who is supposed to be funny. And Matsuko Deluxe, Ikko, kind of really famous examples. Kanoshingo was one who was very popular. And I remember, Tony, you mentioned him.
Yeah, for a little while. He was quite popular, then kind of disappeared.
Yeah, and he kind of speaks to that very, like talents rise and fall. Kanoshingo was very interesting because his whole shtick was that he went from hyper mask to hyper like at the drop of a hat. And we can talk maybe about some of that because it's quite relevant. But the fact of the matter is that up until the present day, this is the typical representation in mainstream media of same-sex desiring men. This idea of the kind of camp, funny, but also quite the term in Japanese that's used is dokuzetsu, so poisonous tongue. So they if you think about Matsuko Deluxe in particular, very, very quick to anger and quite like nasty, but in a funny way, I guess is how you could put it. And basically the controversy that surrounds these representations, both within mainstream society and amongst, gay men and so forth. And it's actually central to the argument that I develop in my book, is that these kinds of representations of gay men are born out of a particular way of understanding gender and sexuality in Japanese culture and society that has particularly taken root since the modernization of Japan in the kind of let's to keep it simple, we'll talk about it in the post-Meiji era, so 1868 onwards, though we can trace it back a little further, in which Japan's kind of system of understanding gender and sexuality, which was much less identitarian and much less about the kind of eternal essence of someone, if you will, what academics call essentialist, was more focused on aesthetics and behaviors, for instance. So what we saw is this shift towards what we call a heteronormative framework in which sexuality is collapsed into a default relationship between a male and female pair, which are positioned oppositionally, in which a man actively kind of desires a woman, and women are objects of that desire who do not possess desire in and of themselves, which of course is ludicrous. But the fact of the matter is that within this framework, up until very recently, the only way in which same-sex attraction between men could be conceptualized was the idea that gay men had to be women trapped in male bodies. So we talk about this in Japanese as onagokoro, the idea that they are somehow possessors of women's hearts, but this is kokoro in its more metaphysical sense. So this is the background why we have these sorts of kind of entertainers on Japanese television, and they've been there since the post-war period. And it has been controversial. And I frame in the very opening chapter of my book a conversation I had with one of my key informants, a young man with the pseudonym I give in the book, Shotaro, who contrasts the on-air characters that you see on Japanese television with the more kind of hyper-masculine, stereotypically kind of bulky, kind of gay macho clone that you see within Japan's gay media. And he's talking specifically about a gay porn star who was very popular when I was doing my fieldwork back in the early to mid 2010s, a guy named Komasaki. And what was interesting is that he was saying, oh, well, this is a positive thing because gay media demonstrates that we're not all these camp queers who are hyper effeminate and dangerous, and that we can actually lay claim to stereotypical masculinity, blah, blah, blah. And up until recently, that's where the scholarship on gender and kind of queer experience in Japan would stop. Gay media presents a positive recuperation of masculinity within the context where Japanese mainstream media kind of presents gayness as somehow always already effeminate. And initially, when I went across to Tokyo to begin my study, that's what I expected to find. What then happened, though, with that conversation with this informant was he then kind of took a really sharp turn and began expressing to me all of these anxieties, because he wasn't like this kind of bulk macho. He actually was someone who, if I was going to use a Japanese term, was a bishonen, slim, beautiful, hoso macho, kind of slim and cute and more soft, for want of a better word. And he began explaining to me how the pressures to live up to these hypermasculinity, like this hypermasculinity that has emerged in reaction against mainstream society's positioning of gay men as, women in male bodies. He began talking about all the anxieties and the pressure and how he couldn't feel like he couldn't live up to that. And it made me have this kind of double take in this really significant moment for me, where I realized that actually this dualistic framing between mainstream media and gay media in Japan was simply continuing the heteronormativity and this binaristic thinking around gender. It wasn't actually freeing people from the anxieties that was introduced through that. In fact, it was reinforcing them. So the book is actually very provocative in the sense that the people that I interviewed and the observations that I have seen and the analysis of media that I conduct throughout the book is specifically trying to understand these regimes of desire, the ways in which people are conditioned and educated to think through desire in particularly regimented ways that reinforce the kind of negative thinking around gender and sexuality in Japan rather than challenge them. And that really is what the book's all about. And it's also partly what my scholarship is mobilized by, because I'm kind of committed to the idea that we can't have emancipation if we are overly utopic or overly kind of celebratory of Japanese queer culture. We need to actually hold up a mirror to it. And I do this not as some kind of disengaged outsider, kind of like looking in and saying, oh, Japan, you're all wrong. This is the narrative that I have been taught through my interactions with the gay men that I worked with over several years. And I came to Japan expecting to see positive, and I left, unfortunately, being very disillusioned.
Mm-hmm. No, like I've through doing this show and just through my own, studies and all that, I sometimes have, read books like yours where I guess it's a more like anthropologistic approach where you like go and you talk to informants and you're on the ground and you're there. Like, for example, for this show, I talked to Dr. Tom Gill, I think it is, who did the
Tom, brilliant.
Yeah, he did the book on homelessness and day labor.
Yes,
in Japan, and
interestingly, my PhD supervisor, Professor Carolyn Stevens, did her fieldwork in the same place called Kabukicho in Yokohama, and they so I visited there, and I know Tom quite well, and like you're quite right that there is this anthropology is based in this kind of in-depth working in the community, engaging with the people and learning from them. Mm-hmm. And it really is about trying to understand. Anthropology is the study of culture, and the study of culture means the study of people and how they relate to each other and create meaning. And you can really only do that if you engage on the ground. And one of my things about this book that's kind of key is that I don't just sit there and analyze the media that I look at, gay magazines, gay dating sites, pornographic videos, manga, comics, and advertising, which are some of what I look at. Mm-hmm. Like, I do so only via looking at the patterns of consumption that the individuals that I met with and talked to kind of actually engaged in. And more significantly, I place the analysis within the broader understanding of how a site like Shinjuku Ni-chome, a nightlife district geared towards commercializing gay desire, produces particular consumer behaviors and logics. And this is very much like it's classic anthropology, to the point where it's a little bit old hat in some regards, to be fair. It's not my methods aren't necessarily revolutionary.
No, but my point was that I love how you get to kind of peek into this world. You get these real world people. Actually, you hear their opinions in their words, and you're out there talking to, like, for example, like I want to ask you a little bit about Ni-chome and how it kind of, in the morning, it seems like a totally different day. But there's this one scene in, I think it was the intro or maybe the chapter 1 of the book, where you approach just some random, probably like some salaryman type guy. It's like,
yeah.
And he was kind of like rushing to try to get through Ni-chome. Like, I love these little snapshots into like life, right? So
we call them vignettes.
Yeah.
I mean, and the book really is, especially the first 3 chapters before I shift to looking in depth, that I actually chart and follow the lives of 4 specific individuals, because my rationale being it's based on conversations and interviews with many more, of around 50 people. But I've narrowed in on 4 particular individuals in the second half of the book, because I'm studying desire, I'm studying sexuality, I'm talking to people about things like, so what kind of porn gets you off? Like, you need to go in depth, very personal in those sorts of things. But at the same time, in order to get an understanding of the kind of macro, or the way that a space like Shinjuku Ni-chome operates day to day, you do need to just kind of hang around there, or perhaps lurk, if you will, and have conversations. Like my methods were about being in the space and approaching people, obviously telling them who I was and what I was doing, and then asking them to explain things that I saw. I talk about in the introduction to the book how a lot of what I did was that I would kind of walk through the district with like 3 or 4 men, and I'd point out at signs, or I'd show things, and I'd say, what's going on? Can you explain to me why this is important? So the story and this kind of narrative that I put up of Ni-chome, and I kind of created this kind of chronological snapshot of the district to kind of explore how it both functions as a safe space for the gay male community, but then think about how the consumption that happens there is kind of structured in particular ways that maybe lessen the emancipatory power of that safe space. And you're right, there is this moment where very early on in my fieldwork, I was there in the morning, and Shinjuku Ni-chome, because it's a nightlife district, it's basically dead in the morning, but people move through it on their way to Shinjuku-san Chome railway, like the metro station. And it was quite interesting, because a lot of the gay men and the business owners in the district that I would interview would often say that, Shinjuku Ni-chome doesn't feel very gay in the morning. It's not really like this queer district. And yet here's this ostensibly straight salaryman that I've just bumped into, and I'm like, why? Like, well, I'm just going to talk to him. I'm just like, okay, like I'll just approach him. And he's like, he tells me like, I need to get through here quickly. I need to catch the train here every morning, but I feel uncomfortable doing so because I know what happens here at night.
I know what happens
and does so to kind of reinforce his own heterosexuality.
Yeah.
And that's it. Just kind of it's a really key moment. Like when we move through an urban space, or when we move through the city, and like if you're a foreigner moving through Tokyo, for instance, in different parts of Tokyo, you might even feel this yourself. Like that process of engaging with the city and moving through it is formative of your own, I don't want to say identity, but your kind of experiences, or your subjectivity is the fancy word we use. But like, and it is, and I've always been really interested in that, because I think of one of the things that I argue in this book is that we should be considering a space like Shinjuku Ni-chome like a form of media, as much as like the other forms of media that I explore in the book, and that it's all interconnected in this kind of capitalistic mess, to put it bluntly.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it is super interesting, just that transition, and like, the awareness of like, oh, people might see me in this space, but then you go like, really? Like, are people going to remember you're the guy that just walks through? Like, come on. Like,
well, I mean, he does go through every day. I think that's part of it.
I guess, but
I mean, there is a certain amount of there is a certain amount of eye rolling that happens on my behalf there. Obviously, not in front of the informant, but at the same time, you know, there's other vignettes where at the end of a night. So basically, to give a very quick snapshot of, and it's much more detailed in the book, is that basically Shinjuku Ni-chome has this kind of general process of waking up every day that is this kind of cycle in which the emergence of like advertising and then the opening of kind of both stores such as the infamous gay shopper, which are gay shops that sell basically porn but a whole bunch of other things, the quote unquote host clubs of Shinjuku Ni-chome, which unlike the host clubs of Kabukicho, which is just to the north, the ones in Shinjuku Ni-chome actually are sex worker premises. And that's just because in Japan, prostitution is illegal, but because it's defined as vaginal penetration, it means that male sex work becomes legal if it's between men, which is just, baffling. And then, you know, there's bars and clubs that open later, and then the people begin swelling into the district to engage with the media that's there, or to engage with each other, or to party and so forth. And like this shift from a very sleepy, quiet space to a hugely kind of, especially during the summer, to be honest, like it's incredibly lively. It spills out onto the street, and it's like carnivalesque. But at the same time, it can be quite closeted and no pun intended, and closed, because it is also supposed to be a world apart, right? And then at the end of the night, you know, just after the last train, everyone's kind of trudging back towards JR Shinjuku Station, and there's this kind of mass exodus of the people who don't want to keep on partying it on in the district, and how they talk. You know, I participated in that exodus so many times, both for pleasure and for work, and just kind of the kind of glumness, and I remember one of the people that I was talking to as I walked back from Ni-chome to the station, they talked about it as being traumatic. Like you feel like you're ripped out of this space that was fun and empowering, to a point. Like that empowerment is always up to a point. So yes, within the broader landscape of the city, Shinjuku Ni-chome, as well as other gay districts that exist in Tokyo, it isn't the only one. There's one in Ueno, there's one in Shimbashi, for instance. Like they function as a safe space away from a society that is relentlessly heteronormative, and I don't want to go so far as to say homophobic, because I think that that's a very loaded term, but that is, you know, not structured in a way that is designed to have gay people flourish and live their lives as best as they can, right? And that's because, you know, Japan has a lot of discrimination, but we're not talking about like hate crimes, right? And just the pressure that builds up on having to live behind a mask, right? Particularly amongst kind of older generation, Gen X and above. Like that's very stressful. So you need a space like Shinjuku Ni-chome to release that stress. And no wonder like moving out of it in the evening is kind of like incredibly discomforting for the men who. But at the same time, one of the things that I stress about Shinjuku Ni-chome through this book, and I think is significant, is that within that rarefied queer space, if you will, there are hierarchies of desirability and knowledge systems that exist within Ni-chome itself that resuscitate the very forms of exclusion that mainstream society uses to exclude gay men in principle. And this is like, and none of this is particularly for those people who are familiar with gay male culture around the globe. It wouldn't be surprising to learn that there's a valorization of youth, a valorization of like, you know, washboard abs and rippling pectorals and gym training and kind of like this kind of jock ideal, to use kind of North American slang. Not the kind of slang that would appear in Japan, and that the kind of party boy lifestyle that Shinjuku Ni-chome produces and that is perpetuated in Japan's gay media is a remarkably apolitical lifestyle. That is one that is not about engaging with kind of queer issues, or LGBTQ politics, except in a very facile or simplistic way that is designed to lead you to consume. And that's because the media, gay media in Japan, has one important logic, and that logic is consumption, and it's about making money, and it sells a fantasy of liberation. If you subscribe to particular aesthetics, consumer behaviors, and participate in specific spaces, that will apparently lead you to what the now defunct gay magazine Buddy would call a happy gay life. And this is what an academic named Laurent Vaillant refers to as cruel optimism. It sells you a fantasy that you can never achieve, and that means the utopic fantasy actually becomes a hindrance to your development. And I consider the regimes of desire in Shinjuku Ni-chōme as operating thusly, and that's because they are embedded within a broader consumer politics that is very typical of Japan post-lost decade in the kind of 21st century, in which to consume is how we manage our identity, is how we explore our engagement with the world. And that also is reflected in, for example, the work that I'm now doing on fandom culture in Japan and across East and Southeast Asia as well.
Mm-hmm. So then let's get into some of that Johnny's research that you've been working on. Also, like, I know in the book, like I found it so interesting how some of your informants, there was at least one or two interactions in the parts that I read that they were kind of negative towards Johnny's and kind of like this depiction of masculinity that Johnny's has kind of emitted into society. So I assume this all must be interconnected in what you're working on now, but I don't know, could you give us
yes it is idea? Yeah, and I have to full disclosure, when I was in university in particular, my bachelor's, I was a massive Johnny author. I was super into Johnny's. I'm still kind of into it now.
They've got some catchy songs. Hey, I got no problem admitting that.
I mean, they have good songs, if you will. But I'm there for, let's just say, other reasons. Leave it there.
Yeah.
But the thing is that, one of the, I mentioned this in the book, there's this magazine that I was talking about, Buddy, which now no longer is published. And actually, I should mention that the former editor of Buddy was Matsuko Deluxe.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that's where she got her start. She, I think, is the best pronoun in English for her. And anyway, so with this Johnny's thing, basically the core argument around the regimes of desire that I make through conversations and observations and analysis of media is that there is a tension that exists between quote unquote hard or katai masculinity and soft or yawarakai masculinity. And there has been a lot of writing in academic kind of tomes, if you will, about how the 21st century and the rise of Johnny's entertainment in particular in the 80s and 90s as a kind of mainstream aesthetic shifted in a renewed kind of focus on the Bishonen as young people in particular began to move away from the kind of hyper-masculine ideals of immediate post-war society. And that may be true. But what I began to encounter in my fieldwork in Shinjuku Ni-chome and through my analysis is that in responding to the same pressures that emerged in the kind of lost decades of the 1990s, that Japan's gay male media had actually become reactive rather than progressive. So it kind of burrowed down into the kinds of masculinities that the rest of society was beginning to question. And this kind of most simply, the easiest manifestation of this within the conversations I was having, and there's a whole chapter on the politics of hard versus soft masculinity, were in two domains. One was with relationship to idol culture, which I don't explore in the book as much as I would now choose to do. And then the other example is debates over this genre of media called boys love. And yeah, so there was this in Buddy magazine, there was a yearly ranking of the most hated celebrities amongst gay men. And this is not a scientific, obviously, survey.
Yeah.
But the fact that it was published and was being used within a broader magazine that was about selling this particular kind of lifestyle.
Sure.
What was really interesting to me is that there were two people who was always at the top, and that was Kimotaku,
Wow.
and the other one was Wada Akiko.
Wada Akiko? Wow, I was not expecting Wada Akiko.
Now I'm actually so like the Kimotaku thing is significant because Kimotaku emerged as the kind of poster boy of the Bishonen aesthetic that Johnny's championed from the late 80s through to the 1990s up until the early 2000s. Like, he was, through his entanglement with the trendy drama system and advertising, and most importantly, his role in fashion magazines geared towards men, Kimono Takuya and his, like, you know, his beautiful long hair and his kind of like softer features was kind of the kind of representation of this the rise of the Bishonen to a more mainstream prominence outside of just kind of women's media into more kind of general media. So the fact that there was a reaction against that, and I had so many kind of people that I was interviewing telling me that they didn't like Johnny's because of their, you know, they're hosomacho, they're too thin and they're not like, they're girly and they're effeminate. It went so far as that one of my interlocutors referred to it as a Bishonen no Noroi, that Japan was cursed by Bishonen.
Yeah.
And Johnny's was kind of viewed at the heart of that. Now, of course, there are gay men who are fans of Johnny's and would not subscribe to this kind of attitude. And some of my key interlocutors were some of these people. And of course, for me, who's someone who's a fan of both J-pop and K-pop idols, you know, I had to navigate these people telling me that they're like ugly and not very good looking and blah, blah, blah. I'm kind of like, oh, I kind of like them. You know, and but the thing is that even those people who do like them or do engage with them, like, positively, they always had to justify it in face of a broader mainstream within, and when I say mainstream, I mean mainstream in Japan's gay culture, where that was considered not normative, right? And this is my point, that just because these regimes of desire exist doesn't mean that you have to subscribe to them. You can reject them. You can kind of say, I'm not going to play this game, or I think this is bullshit. But the thing is that in making that choice, you need to justify yourself. Whereas if you just want to kind of ape the kind of, oh yeah, I only like really buff guys, mask for mask, no, Johnny's yuck. Like, you don't have to justify yourself. There's no need to kind of say, you know, there's something wrong with my desires and I need to kind of explain them to you and convince you that I have a right to them. And that's what really concerned me once again. And I have instances in the book, and I won't go into detail because, you know, if you're interested, listeners, feel free to order yourself a copy from the University of Michigan Press.
Link in the show notes. Link in the
like,
show notes.
very, very like stories of trauma, stories of like, you know, psychological harm, real harm. This isn't like, what I'm talking about here isn't just like hypothetical harm or symbolic violence. Like, it's real harm that was some people were having to deal with on a day-to-day basis in a space and engaging with media that was supposed to be a support in times of suffering. And the fact of the matter is that the majority of the literature on Shinjuku Ni-chōme in particular, and Japan's gay culture and media as well, tends to have this kind of utopic celebration. And now in some of my other work, I have kind of shifted my focus towards this more emancipatory and kind of more positive focus in my writing. That's because literature has been too negative, right? So my work on boys' love tends to be more reparative, because the previous literature is negative. Likewise, because the previous literature on Shinjuku Ni-chōme and Japan's gay culture tends to be rather celebratory, I decided that no, I need to kind of complicate that. So it's not me trying to be some kind of doom and gloom person, but as I say to my students, like, you know, I complicate and I show you the problems, because we can't just apply things with rose-tinted glasses, because if we do, then we're just kind of perpetuating the systems that are causing the problems. And yes, you could say, so what right does some random white Australian boy have to kind of go in and say this? But I think that one of the things that I always emphasize when I talk about this is that I came to Japan with the emancipatory idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's because Japan had been emancipatory for me as well. And hence the book is like, I was radicalized by my interlocutors. It wasn't that I came there with some idea that I'm gonna demonstrate that this place is crap and rah, 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 rah. No, that wasn't it. The opposite. I have turned into what I have, and the book is a product of the experiences that were shared with me and the stories that were shared with me and what I saw on the ground. I would also say that Shinjuku Ni-chome also has some problematic racial politics. It's replete with like anti-Asian xenophobia, anti-blackness in many ways. There were lots of South Asians, people from the subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, that were there that were just getting no interest whatsoever. I was able to access spaces in Shinjuku Ni-chome that are strictly Japanese people only because of my language skills and my kind of scholarly affiliation, that usually I would get kicked out. But even then, there were times when I was kicked out, rather gently, usually. It's not nastily done.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the things, like, it was all of these compounded experiences and sitting down and like talking to, for example, the gay men who do like Johnnies and feeling or want to be cute. One of my informants like was quite kind of clear. It's like, I want to be so shokuke danshi. I want to be that kind of herbivorous boy. I want to be cute. I want to be a bishonen, but society and my partner at the time didn't let me. And then, like that kind of damaged his self-esteem. And like, that's really, this is what I saw on the ground while I was doing this research over, about 5 years. And I couldn't hide that. I thought that it would be wrong for me not to. So I had to write what is perhaps not the most positive book, though the final chapter is about trying to be more recuperative and think about hope for future and change, which unfortunately was written in 2019. And then along comes COVID. Screw the whole thing over. So I was very lucky in many ways. I was able to visit Shinjuku Ni-chome in January 2020, just before, like, but when COVID was like this thing that people were talking about, like in the background, right?
Yeah, right.
And at that point in time, there were two things that were being mentioned in Shinjuku Ni-chome. The first was, will the Olympics bring COVID to Japan? And Shinjuku Ni-chome over many years had been kind of gearing up for the Olympics as an important kind of, event, like many kind of entertainment, and that was just Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one was, and this, as I said, should shock no one, is like, it's big in China. Maybe we should be worried about Chinese people.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written elsewhere about a persistent kind of anti-Chinese sentiment that circulates in Shinjuku Ni-chome.
Mm-hmm.
That's been there ever since kind of tourism from the People's Republic of China kind of picked up, and a lot of gay Chinese men would be coming to Japan because of their kind of fantasies of Japan that they've engaged with through consuming Japanese queer media. So these are things that were beginning to emerge. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been on the ground to observe what's happened at Shinjuku Ni-chome during COVID, but from the stories that I was getting told by my friends and my contacts there and colleagues who I know who work there, as well as other academics who've been kind of picking up research in the post-COVID world, like many spaces, Shinjuku Ni-chome was hit hard by COVID. And this was within the context where gentrification and rising cost of living and so forth was already beginning to impact Shinjuku Ni-chome. And since there are many venues in Shinjuku Ni-chome that are specifically focused around catering to foreigners and those who desire them, and by foreigners here I do mean white men, to be quite upfront, those businesses, some of them closed during, like some that have been around for dozens of years, closed because of there was no tourism. And there were fewer expats around, and so forth. So, like Shinjuku Ni-chome, this kind of story that I tell of Shinjuku Ni-chome waking up and then partying through the night and going to sleep, my anecdotally was kind of slowed down during the pandemic. From what I've been told, however, since the kind of relaxation of a lot of the COVID measures and so forth, and of course the opening up of Japan once again to international tourism, it's the district has bounced right back. But the scars will be there forever.
Sure.
And a lot of the businesses and the media that I was looking at, like they really suffered during that period.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've seen on the news, like dining out in general, right, has gone up like 90% or whatever in the past year. So clearly people are going out, people are spending money again. But that being said, cost of living, businesses have gone out, there's bars that probably closed. I mean, these are tiny little establishments.
Exactly. Yeah. Right? And I think that it's important to indicate that, is that the general bar at Shinjuku Ni-chome, and when we say bar, like, think more izakaya, right, or perhaps even like some tatami room transformed into a drinking spot. They're maybe able to cater up to 7 to 10 guests, and that's a large place, right? Some of them are really only big enough for, there's like these tiny little bars that you see in Golden Gai, for instance, which is once again just up the road. Like, and that's because most of the spaces in Shinjuku Ni-chome, they're converted residential spaces, actually. So yes, there are a few larger kind of dance-focused spaces, and there's one in particular called Eagle Tokyo that many foreigners go to that is modeled very specifically and deliberately on a more North American style, and I use North America quite deliberately there, North American style kind of gay club, bar, pub space. But they're not typical. Like, in most foreign visitors to Shinjuku Ni-chome, that's what they see. Yeah. And that's not typical. Like, the typical space in Ni-chome are the smaller, more intimate spaces that have a very specific clientele, what we call their taipu, and that if you don't match it, you don't necessarily get welcomed per se, with exceptions, of course. Some people, are more than happy to let people come in, and then some people who own bars are just assholes, to put it bluntly. So, like,
regardless of sexuality,
exactly right. Like,
that's human.
Some people aren't just very friendly. So this is like one of the things that I argue is that actually there was one of the reasons that we saw the kind of streamlining of types and this kind of like hyper-focused kind of marketing that was focused on, particular physical traits or body shapes or behaviors as indicative of a somehow, and this is true of gay culture in many other spaces around the world. It was about segmenting the population in order to better attract clientele. Now, within a space, a post-COVID world where especially the young people who are the privileged kind of focus of these sorts of districts have less disposable incomes and less free time due to the need to work more. Like, I think that it will begin to kind of impact bottom lines, and like media consumption is becoming increasingly like rare. Like, I was talking a lot about this magazine that I spent a whole chapter analyzing, and that folded in 2019, even before COVID. God only knows how the pornographic industry, like, the porn videos make money, probably through their connections to organized crime, to be honest, because that's it. And everyone should know that, like, Japan's AV and what's known as GV industries have heavy relationships to organized crime. Like, this is like the reality that I'm actually, so I'll be in Japan, rather excited. I'll be on sabbatical, so that's like, a 6-month research trip in the second half of 2023. I'm coming across to work out of the University of Tokyo, and I'll be researching male idol culture. And one of the things I want to do is connect once again with the gay men who participate in Shinjuku Ni-chome and hold, like, who are fans of idols. And there's gay male clubs for some of the kind of Johnny's groups, and I want to kind of work more with them in order to kind of see what the other side looks like, and see how they engage with Johnny's and so forth. And this is also within the context where some of you who may follow Johnny's, some may not, like they've begun to shift their aesthetic, partly in response to competition from South Korean idols who are much more willing to kind of, bulk up and show off the abs, and like male idols from Johnny's are beginning to adopt this kind of aesthetic, which was something that used to only be kind of confined to the male idol groups managed by LDH, so this is Exile Tribe and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
So we're seeing like a kind of bulking up, if you will, a hardening of Johnny's idols in many ways. And I'm curious to kind of learn about what the implications of that are for many types of consumers, heterosexual women, and gay men alike, because I think that it's significant.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And then, of course, in the recent months, Johnny's has been going through a whole shakeup. I think, like, was it the vice president that left? And, what is it, King and Prince? Like, some members.
So that's, I'm really, like, personally quite sad about that one. So my Oshi is remaining. And that is something that I'll be thinking through. I've made no secret of the fact that I kind of work together with the Jimmy Show a little bit here and there, which I can't really talk about with regards to these recent events. But it is something that I'm hoping to look into a little bit more when I'm across, and see if I can kind of look and explore how Johnny's is itself reacting to perhaps the destabilization of their centrality to Japanese media culture, which is very much becoming a thing. Though I would flag, and I can hear one of my regular kind of Johnny's gossip people, who's an entertainment writer, like he's always saying, like, don't forget the numbers. And in terms of numbers, Johnny's are going strong as ever, but that speaks more to the nature of Japan's media industries than anything else. But so these are things that I'm really kind of interested after, like, as I said, my more recent research shifted to Thailand and South Korea and so forth, and interestingly enough, that work eventually led me back to Japan, and that's where I'm going to be over the next 5 to 6 years, because that's how long these research projects tend to take. Like, I will be living a world of Johnny's, I think, which will be an interesting moment. But I'm very excited. Like,
that is super interesting. So I will absolutely love to discuss that further with you at some point later in the future. But of course, everybody, there's a lot more in the book, so you can check you can just check whatever you buy your books, but there's a link in the show notes. And so you can just click on that and check out the rest. As I said, this is like, part of the reason why I like these kind of like anthropologic like approaches is because you get these real person perspectives, these real stories. It at moments, and I mean this in a very complimentary way, it feels more like reading a novel than a research paper. Right? Like you get sucked into it and you want to know, like, what else does this person think? Like, where is this going to go? Like, you want to kind of keep digging instead of just looking at like charts and data. Like, I mean, that's useful too, but I like getting this kind of real world perspective as well. So it's easy to read.
I think that's actually, I mean, that's one of any anthropologist always, like, we tend to think about what we do as writing. We tell stories, but we tell stories critically, right? And like, actually, the highest praise you can give is to say that an anthropological piece of writing reads like a novel. So don't apologize. I'm actually quite, like, I'm kind of like, oh God, like, that's so nice. I'm not sure if it's true, but thank you.
I mean, like,
I lived with this book for a long time,
right?
so I have to admit, now that it's out in the world, I try not to read it at all.
That's how we all are, I know. But
exactly
I think it's super interesting. So again, Regimes of Desire, check out the link. So thank you so much for making time. I know you're super busy, but I appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. And I should say that if anyone's interested more in my research on Johnny's or kind of gay media in Japan and across Asia, do follow my social media.
Check out Twitter. Is that the main one? Twitter?
Yes, yes. I'm very active on Twitter. I mean, God knows what's happening.
Yeah,
with
we'll see
Twitter
what
right
happens
now.
with Twitter, but
But I also do have a personal website that you
oh,
can,
okay.
you can
Yeah,
follow
I have
me
been on
as well.
that. So I'll include the link for all those. I am following you on Twitter, and so I see you.
Yeah.
I see you tweet from time to time. Okay,
As I said, I spend most of my time like there's insightful stuff, but you need to navigate me screaming about various handsome men from various countries around the world.
That's what Twitter's for, right?
Exactly right.
A little smart and a little fun, right? And a little
Yeah,
complaint.
exactly right. Exactly right.
Just do it!